we're traveling back to 16th century England, but not to the world of farmers, soldiers, or ordinary townsfolk. Tonight, we're climbing straight to the top of the social ladder, into the world of lords, ladies, courtiers, and nobles who wore silk, dined on swan, and had their faces immortalized in oil paint, all while the rest of the country survived on coarse bread and prayers for a decent harvest. This isn't a story about peasants. This is a story about the people who had everything, and somehow still found reasons to lie awake at night. Before we begin, a quick thank you to whoever suggested tonight's topic. Every idea you send in genuinely shapes this channel, and I'm grateful for it. If you're enjoying these long, sleepy history deep dives, feel free to like and subscribe, only if you actually want to, and drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from. It's always 3 a.m. somewhere, and honestly, that's the best time for this kind of thing. Now dim the lights. Crack a window if you like the cold air drifting in. Get something to eat. Anything is better than what a Tudor kitchen boy was surviving on, and settle in, because we have a very long night of history ahead of us. Before we step into the past, let's sit with a few questions. What did it actually feel like to be obscenely rich in Tudor England? Did waking up each morning feel like power? Or did it feel like the quiet, constant fear that someone was scheming to take your land? What did breakfast look like when its entire purpose was to impress? How many layers of clothing could a human body reasonably survive wearing before rebelling? Was there ever a single private moment, or were there always servants nearby, watching you eat an apple? And if you ever fell out of the king's favor, did it happen slowly, like a fatting friendship? Or did you simply go to sleep one night and wake up in the Tower of London the next? Let's find out. Waking up rich. Picture this. The year is 1533. You are wealthy. You are powerful. You are wearing nearly 40 pounds of clothing before breakfast. And somewhere down the corridor, a musician is already playing, whether you asked for it or not. In Tudor England, waking up wasn't something you did alone. It was something that happened to you with an audience. For the wealthy, rising from bed wasn't a private morning ritual. It was closer to a small performance, complete with staff, ceremony, and an unspoken understanding that dressing yourself was beneath your station. You didn't own an alarm clock because you didn't need one. A servant, sometimes several, arrived at a set hour, usually around 6 or 7 in the morning, since the Tudor day began early regardless of title or rank. Warm water was brought for washing. A cloth was handed to you, sometimes by a servant whose entire job and pride revolved around handing over that single towel correctly. It sounds absurd today, but in a world with few career paths, being trusted with the Earl's morning towel was a genuinely respectable position. The waking hour doubled as a business meeting. While you were still being dressed, a secretary might read out overnight letters. A steward might need instructions for the day's household matters. There was no lazy stretch of quiet morning coffee. The moment your eyes opened, you were expected to be alert, decisive, and already thinking about the day's political landscape. At the royal court, especially under Henry VIII, this morning ritual became an even more elaborate performance called the lever, a formal ceremony where courtiers competed for the privilege of simply being present while the king dressed. If you were allowed to stand in the room, you were doing well. If you were the one who handed him his shirt, you were doing extraordinarily well. Miss the lever because you overslept, and you'd spend the entire day wondering who had noticed your absence and what conclusions they'd drawn from it. The logic behind all this was simple. Visibility meant safety. The closer you stood to the king each morning, the harder it was for rivals to quietly erase you from his memory. Every single morning was, in its own way, a census of favor: who was present, who was missing, and what that absence might mean. The bedroom, and the impossibility of privacy for all its velvet drapery and towering, carved oak frames. The Tudor bedroom was, ironically, one of the least private rooms in the entire house. The wealthier you were, the more people had a legitimate reason to be standing in it at almost any hour of the day or night. Gentlemen of the bedchamber weren't a ceremonial title with no real function. They were actual working positions, held by real men whose job was to be physically present, while their masters slept, dressed, prayed, argued, and generally lived out his most personal moments in full view of hired witnesses. Privacy, as most of us understand it today, simply wasn't something wealth could buy in this era. If anything, wealth bought you the opposite: more eyes, more ears, more people quietly present in the corners of your life. The bed itself, however, was unmistakably a status symbol. In a great household, the bed frame was massive, heavily carved, and draped in fabric so expensive that a servant's family could likely have lived off the cost of the curtains alone. The canopy overhead wasn't just for show. It genuinely helped block drafts in houses that were, by modern standards, brutally cold in winter. But its decorative embroidery and expensive dye work also served as a very deliberate, very visible reminder of exactly how much money had gone into this one piece of furniture. Beneath the fine wool or feather-stuffed mattress sat a base layer of straw, which meant that even the grandest lord in England was, at the end of the day, sleeping on a stack of dried plant matter. The room, for all its grandeur, likely smelled considerably more like a barn than modern imaginations of luxury tend to suggest. Curtains could be drawn around the bed to create an illusion of privacy, but they solved exactly one problem. Sight. Sound was a different matter entirely. Tudor houses were built from stone and timber, materials with essentially zero acoustic insulation. If you snored, the whole household knew by morning. If you and your spouse argued in hushed voices, the servants had usually pieced together the general shape of the disagreement before sunrise. A mouse scurrying across the floorboards at 3 a.m. wasn't an inconvenience. It was simply Tuesday. Beyond the master bed itself, the sleeping arrangements of the wider household radiated outward like ripples, structured almost perfectly according to rank. The most senior and trusted attendants slept nearest the door of the master's chamber, a position that was as much about proximity to power as it was about actual duty. Everyone else was arranged further away, in a descending order that mirrored the household's entire social hierarchy. Sleeping close to the Lord was considered an honor, and it was also, by any reasonable modern standard, not remotely restful. Here's something modern visitors to preserved Tudor manor houses often misunderstand when they peer at a roped-off, beautifully restored bedchamber. That room was never meant to be a retreat. It was a working room, a venue. A lord might receive a visiting petitioner, sign a legal document, or discuss a dispute over land rights while seated on the very edge of his own bed, because the bedchamber was simply one more stage on which the performance of power continued. Beyond the bedroom itself lay a smaller, more genuinely private space, the closet, sometimes called the privy chamber. This was reserved exclusively for the innermost circle of trusted friends, family, and advisors. Being permitted into the closet was a significant marker of real intimacy, something most people, even fairly important guests, never achieved. The bedroom, in contrast, saw a steady procession of secretaries, physicians, chaplains, messengers, and the occasional lost soul who had wandered in looking for someone else entirely and was too mortified to immediately leave. At night, once the candles were finally snuffed and the heavy curtains drawn, the Tudor bedchamber came about as close to silence as it ever got. An attendant breathed quietly somewhere in the shadows. The fire settled and cracked in the hearth. Cold air crept in through a gap in the stonework that no amount of tapestry seemed able to fully seal. And somewhere down the corridor, there was always someone, was still awake, almost certainly whispering about politics. The long, complicated business of getting dressing in wealthy Tudor households was never something you could rush through. A single outfit might include a linen undershirt, several structured outer layers, a heavily padded doublet reinforced with buckram, a fur-lined gown, detachable decorative sleeves that could be swapped like modern accessories, and a hat carefully chosen to broadcast your exact social rank to anyone watching from across a courtyard. The entire process could easily consume the better part of an hour, required at least 2 attendants working in coordination, and left you smelling faintly of cedar, beeswax, and quiet ambition. Let's start with the foundation. Linen undergarments were worn closest to the skin, a shirt for men, a smock for women, because linen was one of the few fabrics affordable enough to be washed regularly, unlike wool or silk, which were treated far more carefully and far less frequently. For the wealthy, this base layer was soft, finely woven, and often decorated at the collar and cuffs with delicate embroidery, because even your underclothes were expected to make a statement whenever they peeked out above your outer garments. On top of this came the structural layers. The doublet, a fitted, heavily padded, often bone jacket, formed the architectural core of the Tudor male wardrobe. It was rigid, warm to the point of discomfort, and sometimes padded so aggressively across the chest and stomach that the resulting silhouette had very little to do with the actual body underneath. You weren't simply getting dressed each morning. You were constructing an idealized, powerful shape for the world to look at. For women, the process was no less demanding. A structured underdress called a kirtle created the foundational shape, and over it went the gown itself, which for a genuinely wealthy woman could weigh several pounds entirely on its own. Sleeves were frequently separate pieces, pinned or tied on individually, meaning a complete outfit was assembled almost like modular furniture, except this particular furniture had to be worn comfortably enough to survive an entire day at court. None of this was left to personal taste, either. Sumptuary laws dictated, quite literally, who was legally permitted to wear which fabrics and colors. The richest velvets, the most vivid dyes, and the rarest trims were reserved by law for specific ranks of nobility. Wearing the wrong fabric wasn't just a fashion faux pas. It was technically a criminal offense. Clothing in Tudor England functioned as a kind of walking identification system. At a glance, across a crowded hall, you could estimate someone's rank simply by what they had on. The finishing details were where the true theater began. Gold chains, jeweled brooches, rings stacked across multiple fingers, pearls sewn directly into fabric, hats decorated with feathers and metal badges. The overall goal was to produce such an overwhelming visual impression of wealth that anyone looking at you understood your importance before you'd spoken a single word. And then, at the end of each long day, someone carefully took it all apart again. Sleeves unpinned, gown removed, doublet unlaced, so that tomorrow the entire elaborate process could begin once more from scratch. The great hall, feasting, and the politics of dinner if you assumed that mealtimes in a Tudor great house were primarily about hunger. You'd be missing the point entirely. A Tudor feast was never really about food. It was about hierarchy, spectacle, and an intricate, unspoken language of seating arrangements that told every single guest exactly where they stood in the world, long before the first course arrived. The great hall itself was purpose-built for this kind of social theater. Tall ceilings, long trestle tables, and at one end, a raised platform called the dais, where the most important guests sat at what was known as the high table. From there, the social hierarchy of the room descended in a perfectly readable gradient, table by table, until you reached the far end of the hall, where lesser guests and household staff were seated. Sitting at the high table meant you mattered. Sitting below the salt, a phrase that referred to the large, expensive salt cellar placed at a specific point on the table, physically marking the boundary between honored guests and everyone else, meant something entirely different. And everyone in the room understood the distinction instantly. The number of dishes served, their variety, and the sheer visual spectacle of the table were direct, deliberate measures of a host's wealth. A truly grand feast might stretch to dozens of separate dishes, and many of these weren't even meant to be eaten. They were meant to be admired. A whole roasted peacock, its feathers carefully reattached after cooking, so it appeared to be alive and proud at the center of the table, was a real and fairly common centerpiece. The kitchen staff responsible for this presentation took it with total seriousness. Eating itself was a far more physical, hands-on affair than modern dining. Forks were essentially unknown at the table. Guests brought their own personal eating knife, carried much like we might carry a phone today, except this device had exactly one function: cutting and spearing meat. Spoons existed for soups and softer dishes, but fingers were entirely expected, even for most solid food. Food itself was often served atop trenchers, thick slabs of stale bread that soaked up meat juices and sauces, and which were afterward sometimes eaten, sometimes handed off to servants, and sometimes given to the poor waiting outside the kitchen doors. A chaplain said grace both before and after the meal. Musicians, minstrels, typically positioned at one end of the hall, provided a live soundtrack throughout, which was considered a mark of a civilized household, and conveniently also drowned out the sound of any arguments breaking out at the lower tables. Hosting a great feast was also, quite deliberately, an act of demonstrating generosity. Extended household members, distant retainers, and even guests of relatively modest means might all be fed at the Lord's expense in the same hall. Proof that he was wealthy enough to provide for all of them at once. This kind of hospitality was enormously expensive. The cost of food alone for a major feast could rival what a skilled craftsman earned across several months of work. But the alternative, appearing stingy, or worse, financially unable to host properly, carried a cost far higher than money: reputation. What was actually on the table meat sat at the absolute center of any genuinely prestigious Tudor meal, and the sheer variety on offer was remarkable. Beef, venison, mutton, pork, veal, rabbit, hare, and an impressive parade of game birds, including pheasant, partridge, woodcock, heron, and of course, peacock, typically served with its feathers reattached for maximum visual drama. Swan occupied a category entirely its own, technically considered property of the crown. Swans were reserved specifically for the wealthiest households, meaning that eating one wasn't really about flavor. By most contemporary accounts, swan meat was tough and intensely gamey, but rather about the simple fact that you were legally permitted to eat something ordinary people were not. The symbolism mattered far more than the taste. Fish featured constantly for religious reasons. The Christian calendar was dotted with fasting days when meat was strictly forbidden, and the wealthy responded to these restrictions not with modest, simple meals, but with an entirely different kind of extravagance. Elaborate fish dishes prepared with just as much kitchen effort as any feast, using salted cod, fresh river fish, and expensive imported delicacies from the continent. In true Tudor fashion, even religious abstinence was made to look impressively costly. Spices were perhaps the ultimate status symbol of all. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, ginger, and mace were all imported across considerable distances at significant expense, and Tudor recipes used them with what modern cooks might generously describe as enthusiasm bordering on excess. A single dish might layer together multiple warm spices, less for subtlety of flavor, and more as a direct demonstration of the host's access to distant trade networks. Even bread carried social meaning. The finest bread, small, soft, pale white manchet loaves made from carefully sifted flour, was reserved exclusively for the high table. Coarser, darker bread made from less refined flour went to the lower tables. Guests at both ends of the hall could see exactly what the other side was eating, and everyone understood precisely what that visual message meant. And then there was drink. Wine, imported from France and the Mediterranean, was the prestige beverage of choice among the wealthy, consumed in quantities that suggest either genuinely impressive tolerance or a fairly relaxed attitude toward the rest of the afternoon's schedule. Ale and beer were served as well, even at the wealthiest tables, but the quality, variety, and sheer volume of a household's wine cellar remained one of the clearest possible markers of status. Behind the curtain, the kitchen, every effortless-looking feast in the great hall was, in reality, the product of an enormous, chaotic operation happening just out of sight. Large, noble households employed entire armies of kitchen staff, master cooks, undercooks, scullions, spit-turners, pastry specialists, and a dedicated team whose sole job was washing an endless mountain of dishes. The kitchen complex in a major household wasn't a single room, but a series of connected spaces, each with its own dedicated function. The main kitchen with its massive open hearths, a separate pastry house for pies and crusts, a confectionery for sugar work, a larder for storage, and a buttery, which, despite the name, handled drinks rather than dairy. Fireplaces in the main kitchen were enormous, in the grandest households large enough to roast an entire ox at once. On a hot summer day, with several such fires burning simultaneously, the kitchen became genuinely dangerous to work in for extended stretches. Spit-turners, often young boys given this exhausting, low-status job, because they weren't yet trusted with more skilled kitchen work, spent hours rotating heavy spits over open flame, physically punishing labor that likely made more than a few of them reconsider their career path. The master cook, by contrast, held a position of genuine skill and status. A talented cook was a valuable, sought-after asset, sometimes recruited away from rival households with the same competitive intensity modern companies reserve for star employees. He oversaw the entire kitchen operation, managed junior staff, controlled access to expensive spices, and bore full personal responsibility for the quality of every dish that left his kitchen. Getting a dish wrong for an ordinary supper was embarrassing. Getting it wrong for a feast with important guests present could end a career. Every seamless, elegant, effortless-looking dinner in the Great Hall was, behind the scenes, underwritten by hours of chaos, heat, and sweat that had started well before dawn. The guests, seated comfortably at the high table, rarely gave any of it a second thought. Servants, status, and the architecture of the household in Tudor England. The number of servants attached to your name wasn't simply a matter of convenience. It was advertising. A great lord might maintain a household of several hundred people, many of them performing duties that barely needed doing at all, simply because the ability to employ someone for an unnecessary task was in itself the entire point. A gentleman usher to walk ahead of you and clear your path through a crowded corridor. A carver whose sole job was cutting your meat at dinner. A cupbearer who handed you your wine with a precise, ceremonial gesture, because simply picking up your own cup would have suggested you had no one to do it for you. The household was organized into a rigid hierarchy that mirrored, and in some ways amplified, the wider social structure of Tudor England itself. At the very top sat the steward or Lord Chamberlain, who managed the entire domestic operation with an authority that was, within his sphere, nearly absolute. Beneath him sat a layer of specialized officers, each overseeing a single department: the kitchens, the stables, the chapel, the private chambers, the household accounts. Below them came the upper servants, gentlemen and gentlewomen who occupied their roles partly as genuine service and partly as a mark of their own family standing. Since placing a younger son or daughter in a great household was widely considered an advantageous arrangement for a family without a great fortune of its own. Beneath them sat the yeomen and grooms, and at the very base, the pages, young boys whose job titles sounded impressive, but mostly involved carrying things from one room to another, over and over, all day. What's easy to miss from a modern vantage point is that many of these servants were themselves from genuinely respectable, sometimes noble families. Serving in a great household wasn't the humiliation it might appear to be today. It was, in effect, an education. A boy who spent his formative years in a duke's household learned how to move correctly through formal rooms, how to address his superiors with the right degree of deference, and how to absorb the countless unwritten behavioral codes of the upper aristocracy. The household functioned as a finishing school that happened to also involve quite a lot of actual physical labor. The scale of provisioning a large household was, by any measure, staggering. Surviving household accounts from the period record annual quantities of food, fuel, and supplies that suggest these households operated less like domestic residences and more like small, self-contained towns. Hundreds of mouths fed daily, stables housing dozens of horses, an entire separate operation dedicated purely to laundry. Managing all of it required careful bookkeeping, constant negotiation with suppliers, and an administrative capacity that, in modern terms, would be recognized as running a mid-sized business. Then there were the truly personal attendants, the people whose entire working lives revolved not around the household in general, but around one specific person: a body servant, a private secretary, someone responsible solely for the horses. a woman whose sole job was managing the wardrobe. These attendants were present for almost everything: dressing, undressing, illness, grief, private conversation. They witnessed their masters at their very best, and considerably more often at their very worst. Discretion, quietly, was one of the single most valuable qualities a personal servant could possess. Here lies the strange paradox at the heart of wealthy Tudor life. All this service made daily existence more comfortable and simultaneously far less private. You were attended, accompanied, and observed almost every waking moment. You could not walk across a courtyard alone. You could not eat a meal without someone standing nearby to pour your wine and remove your plate. Servants were a luxury, and also, quite gently, a form of constant, expensive surveillance. You were never truly alone, and you could never be entirely sure that something said in a quiet, unguarded moment might not, one day, resurface at the worst possible time. Life at court. The ultimate prize, and the ultimate trap being summoned to court, was considered the absolute pinnacle of Tudor success. And it was also one of the most exhausting, expensive experiences a wealthy family could undergo. Once there, you were expected to dress at the very limit of your financial means, maintain a cheerful expression regardless of your actual mood, laugh at precisely the right moments, and navigate an environment where a single misread glance from the monarch could send an entire career spiraling into ruin. The court itself wasn't fixed to a single location. The monarch moved between palaces: Greenwich, Hampton Court, Whitehall, Windsor, Richmond, on a schedule that was sometimes announced in advance and sometimes not. Following the court demanded both an appetite for constant relocation and the financial resources to make each move look effortless. You could not, under any circumstances, arrive at Whitehall wearing the same outfit you'd worn at Greenwich the month before. An entirely separate court wardrobe was required, representing an investment that could easily exceed what an ordinary farmer might earn across several years of honest labor. Once you had arrived, your time genuinely stopped being your own. You attended the king's meals, his chapel services, his hunting expeditions, and his musical entertainments. If your rank was high enough, you attended his council meetings as well. Absence from any of these events was noticed, discussed, and often interpreted unfavorably as evidence of illness, disloyalty, or a shift in political standing. Being seen was the entire game. Not being seen raised uncomfortable questions that you very much did not want circulating through the palace corridors. At the center of it all stood the king himself, the gravitational force around which every single interaction orbited. Henry VIII, particularly in the earlier decades of his reign, was physically imposing, intellectually sharp, and famously volatile, capable of making your entire year with a single kind word and ending your career with a cold glance. Gaining his attention was the goal. Keeping it, once gained, was the real challenge. He was famously generous toward those he favored, distributing land, titles, and positions with genuine enthusiasm. He was also, as several unfortunate courtiers discovered at great personal cost, capable of a sudden and total reversal of affection that left its victim bewildered, even as the walls closed in around them. Competition for royal favor was constant, quietly vicious, and utterly exhausting. Everyone at court was simultaneously an ally and a potential rival. Genuine friendships did exist, real warmth, real loyalty, but they existed inside a framework where every relationship also carried a political dimension that could activate without warning. The courtier helping you draft a petition this afternoon might, tomorrow, be the very same person quietly mentioning something unflattering about you to exactly the right ear. And through all of it, the expense, the performance, the endless low-grade vigilance, you were expected to maintain the appearance of someone thoroughly enjoying themselves, someone who couldn't imagine being anywhere else in the world. It was, in its own exhausting way, one of the most demanding theatrical roles of the entire era. The courtiers who lasted the longest were the ones who somehow made the performance look completely natural. The politics of fabric, sumptuary laws, and the business of looking rich. The Tudor government cared deeply about making sure you dressed exactly according to your station, not out of any particular concern for aesthetics, but because clothing was, quite literally, a form of communication. Rank needed to be legible at a glance, from across a crowded hall or a busy street, and the sumptuary laws existed to guarantee exactly that. These laws dictated, with surprising precision, which fabrics, colors, and styles each social class was legally permitted to wear, and the restrictions grew more elaborate with nearly every new reign. Purple silk was reserved exclusively for royalty. Crimson was set aside for the highest ranks of nobility. Velvet was permitted, but only in carefully regulated quantities, depending on your title. Wearing the wrong fabric could technically result in a fine, meaning Tudor England employed, in effect, its own fashion police. The logic behind all this, while somewhat revealing of the ruling class's anxieties, was fairly straightforward. If anyone at all could dress like a nobleman, then nobody could be reliably identified as one. The entire visual language of rank, the ability to tell, at 50 paces, whether the person approaching you was someone you needed to bow to, or someone who needed to bow to you, depended entirely on this kind of legibility. Allowing a wealthy merchant to stroll around in purple silk wasn't merely a fashion violation. It represented, to the anxious aristocratic mind, something closer to a full-blown identity crisis for the entire social order. In practice, enforcement was inconsistent at best. Ambitious merchants and rising members of the gentry frequently wore fabrics and colors technically above their permitted station. And when fines were issued, they were often simply absorbed as an acceptable cost of dressing the way one wished to be seen. Still, the laws shaped behavior in subtler ways, because the true danger of a sumptuary violation was never really the fine itself. It was becoming visibly, embarrassingly conspicuous at court, where everyone noticed everything, remembered everything, and was more than willing to interpret overreach in one area as a warning sign of overreach elsewhere. For those genuinely at the top of the social pyramid, the great nobility, the senior courtiers, these same laws functioned less as restriction and more as guarantee. Your velvet was legally protected. Your crimson belonged to you alone. Walking into a room dressed in fabrics your rank specifically entitled you to wear was a way of visibly, literally wearing your own status on your body, deeply satisfying in the particular way that being provably, legally correct tends to be. Acquiring fine clothing was, in itself, a substantial commercial undertaking. English wool cloth was produced domestically and was of genuinely excellent quality, but the most prestigious fabrics, Italian silks, Flemish velvets, luxury brocades shot through with real gold and silver thread, had to be imported at considerable expense. London's merchant community included specialist importers who dealt exclusively in these luxury textiles, and a truly great household might spend, in a single year, a sum on clothing alone that would seem extraordinary even by modern standards. Buttons, particularly jeweled or enameled ones, could individually cost more than a skilled tradesman's monthly wage. Accessories, operated by their own elaborate, unwritten grammar. The wrong hat, worn in the wrong context, sent an unintended message, whether you meant it to or not. The angle of the brim, whether it was turned up or down, the badge pinned to the front declaring your family allegiances, the specific style of glove appropriate to a specific occasion. All of it required a fluency in visual language that most wealthy Tudor children absorbed from early childhood. Getting it wrong, or being seen to have gotten it wrong, was the kind of social misstep people would still be quietly mentioning months later, in a tone that suggested they had entirely forgiven you, which they almost certainly had not. The uncomfortable truth about Tudor hygiene here's where we need to gently correct a few romantic assumptions about the glamour of Tudor luxury. The wealthy certainly enjoyed better access to clean water, fine linen, and fragrant herbs than the average person. But by any modern standard, the baseline of personal hygiene in 16th century England would not survive close inspection. Bathing happened, but rarely, and not always thoroughly. The rich simply smelled better than the poor because they could afford to layer more expensive scents over the same underlying problem. Full immersion bathing, an actual wooden tub, heated water, complete submersion, did occur in wealthy households, but it was far from a daily or even weekly event for most people. Contemporary medical theory, based on the ancient Greek physician Galen's model of the body, held that bathing opened the pores of the skin and created direct pathways for disease to enter. Under this logic, washing too thoroughly could genuinely make you sick, or worse. To be fair to Tudor physicians, germ theory was still centuries away, and their caution was, in its own strange way, internally consistent with what they believed about the human body. It was, nonetheless, not a great situation for anyone's personal comfort. What the wealthy relied on instead was meticulous linen management. The prevailing belief held that clean linen worn against bare skin absorbed the body's impurities directly, transferring them from body to fabric, which could then be laundered separately, effectively cleansing the body by proxy. This meant that frequently changing one's linen undergarments was, functionally, the primary Tudor hygiene routine. A household wealthy enough to maintain a large rotating supply of high-quality linen was, by the standards of its own era, considered genuinely clean, even if a modern nose might disagree rather strongly. Perfumes, scented oils, and pomanders, small pierced balls filled with aromatic substances, carried in the hand or hung from a belt, served two purposes at once: masking unwanted smells, and, according to the period's medical theory, offering some protection against disease believed to travel through bad air. A great royal court under this system was considerably more heavily perfumed than any modern office building. The combined scent of dozens of pomanders, scented gloves, and burning incense, blending into something that was, by all accounts, genuinely overwhelming. Hair was carefully arranged, but washed only rarely. Teeth were cleaned with cloths, sometimes with various powders and pastes of dubious effectiveness, and the resulting dental health was predictably poor across every social class. The wealthy, with their far greater access to expensive imported sugar, arguably had a specific advantage in destroying their own teeth faster than anyone else in the kingdom. Being rich, in this narrow sense, simply meant you could afford a more exclusive brand of tooth decay. The irony, of course, is that from any reasonable social distance, the Tudor wealthy looked absolutely magnificent. The silks, the jewels, the carefully composed expressions in every portrait. It was only up close that the picture grew considerably more complicated, and in a world so thoroughly organized around maintaining an impressive appearance from a respectful distance, that was, in its own way, a perfectly manageable problem, where even nobility sat down. Toilets, waste, and the great equalizer for all the grandeur of a great Tudor house. The tapestries, the carved stone, the enormous dining tables that could seat 60. The actual sanitation arrangements remained stubbornly, uncomfortably medieval. The garderobe, a small closet-like chamber built into the thickness of an exterior wall, dropping waste directly into a pit, moat, or occasionally straight down into the garden below, was the standard fixture in even the wealthiest homes. Grander houses simply had more of them. Richer lords lined them with somewhat nicer materials, but the basic experience of using one at 2 in the morning in the dead of January was, by every surviving account, not meaningfully improved by wealth. Structurally, a garderobe was little more than a hole in the wall, fitted with a stone or wooden seat above a long vertical shaft. The name itself comes from the French for wardrobe, and it wasn't a coincidence. It was common practice to hang clothing inside the shaft, since the rising ammonia fumes from the waste below were genuinely effective at killing lice and moths. Your finest wool gown, in other words, was frequently stored directly above the household latrine. Tudor practicality had a habit of prioritizing function over dignity. Whenever the two came into conflict, emptying the accumulated waste from beneath a garderobe was a specific, unenviable profession known, with brutal honesty, as a gong farmer. These workers operated at night, by torchlight, removing waste and carting it away from the property. It was widely considered one of the least desirable jobs in the entire kingdom, which, given the competition, was genuinely saying something. But it paid noticeably better than ordinary farm labor, because even in the 16th century, unpleasant work commanded a premium. For personal hygiene afterward, options were limited to cloths, sometimes moss, and in the very finest households, somewhat softer cloths reserved specifically for the purpose. The concept of dedicated hygiene paper simply didn't exist yet. What wealth did provide was access to higher quality materials, and a servant whose job it was to launder them. A genuine improvement in comfort over the alternatives, even if it falls well short of what any modern person would call adequate. The royal palaces offered somewhat grander arrangements. Hampton Court famously included a facility nicknamed the Great House of Easement, a multi-seat communal toilet connected to a proper drainage system that emptied into the Thames. This solved one immediate problem while quietly creating several new ones downstream, given that the Thames simultaneously served as London's primary water source and its main channel for waste disposal. A public health situation the city's residents navigated through a combination of pragmatism and carefully selective inattention. At night, when a trip through cold stone corridors to the nearest garderobe felt like more effort than it was worth, there was always the chamber pot. Emptying and cleaning it was, again, the responsibility of a personal attendant. One more entry on the long list of household jobs that sound thoroughly unpleasant on paper, but were apparently sustainable career choices given the available alternatives. The task was handled quickly, quietly, and without commentary, because discretion was, quite literally, part of the job description. The underlying truth remained constant regardless of title or fortune. No matter how many acres of land you owned, no matter how tall your titles, or how extensive your collection of gold plate, at least once a day, you sat on a cold stone seat above a dark shaft cut into a wall, and briefly confronted the one genuinely democratic experience the human body has ever offered. Tudor wealth bought excellent company at dinner and magnificent clothing for court appearances. It did not, under any circumstances, buy a particularly dignified Tuesday morning. Music, masks, and the exhausting business of court entertainment at the Tudor court was never optional. It wasn't something you engaged in only when the mood struck. It was a daily, sometimes twice daily, obligation performed in front of an audience that frequently included the monarch himself, whose assessment of your visible enjoyment was being quietly logged the entire time. The mask stood as the great art form of the Tudor court, and describing it simply as theater rather undersells the scale of ambition involved. A major mask could take weeks of preparation. Professional designers built elaborate mechanical scenery. Costumes were sewn from the finest available fabrics, sometimes incorporating genuine gold thread and real gemstones. The storylines, almost always drawn from classical mythology and carefully written to flatter the reigning monarch, were composed by poets who took the assignment with total seriousness. Pleasing a king through the specific medium of classical allegory was, by this point, an established and highly specific professional skill. Crucially, the performers in a mask weren't hired actors. The leading roles were played by courtiers themselves, lords and ladies of genuine rank who danced, wore the costumes, and acted out the mythological scenes, culminating in a moment where the performers pulled members of the audience into the dance. A gesture that appeared spontaneous, but was, in truth, rigorously rehearsed and choreographed down to the smallest detail. If you held any reel standing at court, you danced. You danced at formal entertainments, private suppers, and whenever the monarch simply decided the evening called for it. And you danced competently, because dancing poorly in front of Henry VIII was never the impression anyone hoped to make. Music filled every corner of Tudor court life. Henry VIII himself was a genuinely skilled musician and composer, and several surviving pieces are credited to him, meaning the same man dissolving England's monasteries was, in his spare time, also writing music history still studies today. His enthusiasm shaped the entire court's musical culture. Professional musicians were employed in substantial numbers, performing during meals, formal entertainments, religious services, and private gatherings. Essentially any occasion where music could plausibly be justified, which in Tudor court culture was nearly all of them. Games filled the hours between formal entertainments. Card games were enormously popular, and the stakes could be genuinely substantial. Significant sums of money regularly changed hands at the court's gaming tables. The king himself reportedly lost considerable amounts without any visible distress, which was either remarkable equanimity or simply a reminder that money carried a very different weight at his particular scale of wealth. Gambling, whether on cards, dice, or other games, was deeply woven into the social fabric of court life, and losing gracefully was considered a basic, essential social skill. Winning too aggressively against the wrong person, however, was not. What made all of this so strange, viewed from any outside perspective, was the strange coexistence of genuine pleasure and mandatory performance. People truly did enjoy themselves. The music was excellent, the dancing genuinely skilled, the production spectacular, but running underneath all of it was a constant, low current of awareness. You were being watched, your enthusiasm was being quietly noted, and your ability to project cheerful engagement regardless of your actual internal state, was one of the basic, unspoken requirements of simply being present at court. You laughed because things were genuinely funny, and also because laughing at exactly the right moment demonstrated that you belonged in the room in the first place. Hunting, falconry, and the meaning of the countryside for the Tudor wealthy. Hunting was never simply a leisure activity. It was a declaration. A great lord who didn't hunt was a great lord who fundamentally misunderstood what was expected of him. The Tudor hunt was an enormous, carefully choreographed outdoor production involving horses, hounds, hawks, beaters, and huntsmen, governed by an elaborate set of protocols determining exactly who rode where, who was permitted to make the kill, and who received the honor of presenting the trophy afterward. Henry VIII was famously devoted to hunting, regularly covering dozens of miles in a single day out. An impressive feat right up until the point, later in his reign, when his knees and his weight made it considerably less practical. Two main forms of hunting dominated wealthy Tudor life, and each carried its own distinct social weight. Deer hunting, the chase conducted on horseback across open country, was the more prestigious of the two. It demanded excellent horses, well-trained hounds, substantial acreage, and the kind of physical stamina the Tudor aristocracy cultivated partly for genuine enjoyment, and partly because sitting a horse across difficult terrain for 6 straight hours simply required it. The hunt concluded with a ritual known as the unmaking, the ceremonial butchering of the deer according to a strict, specific protocol, with particular cuts assigned to particular participants, and the hounds rewarded in a prescribed manner. Knowing how to perform this ritual correctly was itself considered a mark of a proper aristocratic education. Falconry was the other great hunting tradition, carrying its own elaborate hierarchy of status. Different birds of prey were considered appropriate for different social ranks. A goshawk for a yeoman, a peregrine falcon for an earl, a gerfalcon reserved specifically for a king. Owning the correct bird for your station, keeping it in excellent condition, and flying it with genuine skill were all considered clear markers of your place in the social order. A well-trained hawk represented years of specialized training and a significant financial investment, and a truly successful flight could produce a moment of beauty striking enough that Tudor courtiers occasionally wrote poetry about it, which tells you something meaningful about what this era considered genuinely moving. The parks and forests surrounding a great Tudor estate weren't open wilderness in any modern sense. They were carefully managed landscapes, enclosed deer parks with fenced boundaries, deliberately maintained to sustain a sufficient deer population for regular hunting, and staffed by dedicated keepers whose job was protecting the game from poachers. The legal right to hunt deer was restricted almost entirely to the wealthy, and poaching, taking game from land you had no legal right to hunt, carried genuinely serious consequences. This was, in part, practical game management. Mostly, though, it was a pointed statement about exactly who was permitted to enjoy the natural world and who was not. Royal forests represented an even more extreme version of this same principle. Forest law, dating back to the Norman conquest, protected enormous tracts of land specifically for royal hunting, with strict restrictions on clearing, settlement, and everyday use by ordinary people. Cutting timber for fuel inside a royal forest was illegal. Grazing livestock, there was illegal. Being found with a dead deer anywhere near a royal forest boundary was the kind of situation that called for genuinely excellent legal representation and an unusually persuasive explanation. The king's hunting privileges were protected quite directly at the expense of everyone who happened to live nearby. Architecture as ambition, building to impress if you were wealthy in Tudor England and hadn't recently added at least one substantial new wing to your house. People were going to start asking uncomfortable questions. The great Tudor country house wasn't primarily designed with comfort in mind. It was designed for impact. Enormous gallery, windows flooding interior rooms with natural light, ornately decorated plaster ceilings, perfectly symmetrical facades, topped with decorative chimneys visible from half a mile away. Every architectural decision functioned as a calculated display of resources, connections, and the deeply held belief that a guest should feel a little overwhelmed the moment they rode through your gatehouse. The gatehouse itself deserves particular attention. In earlier centuries, a great house's gatehouse had served a genuinely defensive purpose. Thick walls, a working portcullis, the full arrangement. By the Tudor period, that defensive function had largely become symbolic. But the gatehouse remained standing because it now served an arguably more important role. The announcement, approaching a Tudor gatehouse, told a visitor everything the owner wanted them to know before they'd even entered the property. Its height, its decorative stonework, the family's heraldic symbols carved prominently above the archway, broadcasting lineage and alliances in stone for the benefit of anyone who hadn't already been fully briefed. The gatehouse functioned as a kind of title page, with the house beyond serving as the book itself. Inside, the arrangement of rooms communicated hierarchy through physical space with exactly the same precision that seating arrangements communicated it at the dinner table. The great hall remained the central public room, even as its practical function shifted over time away from communal dining and toward a more purely ceremonial role. Beyond it, accessible only to those with sufficient status, lay the great chamber, then the presence chamber, then the privy chamber, then the bedchamber itself, and finally the innermost, smallest, most private closet. Each successive room grew smaller, more richly decorated, and accessible to fewer and fewer people. The architecture itself, quite literally, enacted the entire Tudor social order, filtering visitors out step by step as they moved deeper into the house, until only the truly trusted remained standing at its center. The long gallery represented one of the Tudor period's most distinctive architectural contributions. A room running the full length of the house, windows lining one wall, family portraits lining the other, used for indoor walking during bad weather, for private conversation, and for displaying generations of ancestral portraits in a format that functioned simultaneously as an art gallery and a genealogical argument. Walking the length of a long gallery meant walking past the painted faces of your ancestors, your royal connections, and occasionally the monarch himself, if your family had been fortunate enough to receive a royal portrait. All of it carefully arranged to tell one specific, deliberate story about exactly who your family was and how long they had mattered. Building on this scale was expensive, continuous, and fundamentally competitive. Word that a neighboring family had added a new great chamber, complete with an imported Italian plasterwork ceiling, created genuine pressure to respond with something equally impressive. When the monarch expressed admiration for a particular house, every ambitious nobleman with building plans of his own took careful mental notes. Some great houses were built so lavishly that the construction itself effectively bankrupted the family, leaving behind a magnificent shell of a building with no remaining income to properly maintain it. A handful of these houses, Longleat, Hardwicke Hall, Berkeley House among them, survive today as genuine success stories. Behind each one, historians count dozens of more modest projects that quietly overextended a family's finances without ever quite achieving the intended effect. Gardens built for show, not solitude. The gardens surrounding a great Tudor house were never intended as peaceful retreats for quiet reflection. They functioned as additional outdoor rooms, arranged with exactly the same careful attention to hierarchy and display as anything inside the house, just with considerably more wind involved. Intricate geometric patterns of clipped herbs and low hedges demonstrated quite clearly that you could afford to employ someone whose entire job consisted of maintaining a decorative hedge. You were, in short, too important to pull your own weeds. Topiary, fountains, and raised terraces built specifically so you could stand above the whole arrangement and survey it with appropriate satisfaction. All of it worked together toward the same underlying goal. The knot garden stood as the signature Tudor garden form, and understanding its appeal requires understanding that its entire charm was deliberately artificial. Nature, left entirely to its own devices, does not produce interlocking geometric patterns of clipped box, thyme, or lavender. Someone, several someones, in fact, produced that effect by imposing rigid human order onto plant material that would otherwise grow however it pleased. A knot garden, therefore, demonstrated two things simultaneously: that you possessed the aesthetic vision to conceive of such a design, and that you had the resources to fund its constant, never-ending maintenance. Since a knot garden left unattended for even a single season quickly begins drifting back toward the natural disorder, always lurking just beneath its carefully clipped surface. The plants chosen for a knot garden were frequently fragrant. Lavender, rosemary, thyme, and santolina were popular choices, meaning that a walk through the garden engaged both sight and smell at once. Pleasant scent was highly valued during this period, believed to offer a degree of protection against disease carried through corrupted air. Meaning, a good-smelling garden was, by Tudor logic, doing meaningful work on multiple levels simultaneously. Beyond the formal knot garden lay the wider grounds, orchards, kitchen gardens, herb gardens, ornamental fish ponds, and in the very grandest estates, a deer park stretching the managed landscape for miles in every direction. Even the kitchen garden, a purely practical installation growing vegetables, fruit, and culinary herbs, tended towards strict geometric order, since the Tudor eye generally found irregular, untamed arrangements somewhat unsettling. A well-organized kitchen garden was its own point of quiet pride, and a household's ability to provision its own table from its own land was considered a meaningful marker of self-sufficiency. Water features occupied a particularly prestigious place in Tudor garden design. A working fountain required both the engineering skill to construct it and the ongoing resources to maintain a functioning water supply, meaning moving water in a garden was expensive and therefore desirable. Hampton Court's water gardens drew visitors specifically to admire them, and smaller estates aspired to something comparable, however modest, at their own scale. The garden also served as an important social space, a venue for walking, talking, and being seen outdoors, offering slightly more freedom of movement than an indoor room, while still operating within the same fundamental framework of display and observation. A private walk in the garden could be genuinely private, or it could be a carefully managed, semi-private conversation held in a setting where the strict formality of the Great Hall didn't quite apply, though the underlying awareness of being watched never entirely disappeared either. Medicine for the wealthy, better doctors, same bad science being rich in Tudor England meant access to trained physicians rather than ordinary barber surgeons, which sounds like a genuine improvement, right up until you learn what those physicians actually believed and practiced. The Galenic system of humoral medicine, built on the theory that illness resulted from an imbalance among four bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, remained the dominant medical framework of the age. In practice, this meant that expensive, high-status medical treatment still typically involved being bled, purged, or prescribed an herbal remedy that, by most accounts, tasted roughly like a damp field. The genuine advantage of wealth here was access and attentiveness rather than actual medical accuracy. A properly qualified Tudor physician was a university-educated man, trained at Oxford, Cambridge, or one of the great continental medical schools, having spent years studying the works of Galen and Avicenna. He emerged from this education with a thorough sophisticated theoretical framework for understanding illness. A framework that happened to be almost entirely wrong in its basic assumptions. He could converse fluently in Latin, debate the finer points of humoral theory with genuine intellectual polish, and confidently explain precisely why your fever resulted from an excess of hot, wet humors. What he generally could not do was actually cure whatever was making you sick. His confidence, however, remained entirely genuine, and in this period, confidence counted for a great deal. Uroscopy, the examination of a patient's urine, served as the physician's primary diagnostic tool. Its color, clarity, and smell were all believed to reveal meaningful information about the internal state of the patient's humors, and a physician would study a flask of urine with the intense focus of someone reading an important legal document, which, from his own professional perspective, was more or less exactly what he believed he was doing. The wealthy paid substantial fees for this service, whether it produced meaningfully better health outcomes than skipping the examination entirely, is a question medical historians tend to approach with considerable diplomatic caution. Bloodletting remained a cornerstone of treatment across the social spectrum. The underlying principle held that removing blood could help rebalance the body's humors, reduce fever, and address an impressively wide range of complaints. The amount removed and the specific timing of the procedure were sometimes governed by astrological considerations, and the actual bloodletting was performed either by the physician himself or by a barber surgeon acting under his direction. Leeches offered a somewhat gentler alternative, applied to specific points on the body, and left to draw blood in a more controlled, self-limiting manner. Most Tudor patients accepted leeches with quiet resignation. Unpleasant, certainly, but a clear improvement over the lancet. Herbal medicine represented the more genuinely useful side of Tudor healthcare, even if the underlying theory explaining its effects remained largely mistaken. Many plant-based remedies did contain real, measurable biological activity. Willow bark, which naturally contains salicylic acid, the same active compound found in modern aspirin, was widely used to treat pain and fever. Various other herbs carried genuine antimicrobial or anti-inflammatory properties. Tucked among the extensive, largely ineffective, and occasionally outright dangerous Tudor pharmacopoeia sat a meaningful number of preparations that actually worked, even though nobody at the time fully understood why. What wealth ultimately purchased in medical terms was access, personal attention, and the best standard of care available at the time. Genuinely better than nothing, and considerably better than what the poor could access, but still fairly likely to leave a seriously ill patient worse off than when treatment began. Great households kept physicians on permanent retainer, and when a fever refused to break or a wound began to fester, the physician sat at the bedside, adjusted his diagnosis, recommended further bloodletting, occasionally consulted astrological charts, and largely waited for the patient's own immune system to settle the matter on its own. Wealthy women. Power without authority life for wealthy women in Tudor England was built entirely out of contradictions. A noblewoman could be enormously influential, shaping alliances, managing vast estates, directing household finances, wielding real soft power that rarely appeared in any official record, while simultaneously holding almost no formal legal authority whatsoever, and being, in the eyes of the law, essentially her husband's property. The great Tudor noblewoman operated inside a system deliberately designed to limit her, and the most successful women became remarkably skilled at achieving their goals entirely through channels the system had simply failed to think to close off. The legal framework left no room for ambiguity. Under the doctrine known as coverture, a married woman's legal identity was, in effect, absorbed entirely into her husband's. She could not own property in her own name. She could not enter into contracts independently. She could not appear in court as a legal party in her own right. Everything she brought into the marriage became her husband's. Everything she managed, earned, or cultivated during the marriage legally belonged to him as well. If her husband died, however, her independent legal identity snapped back into shape, meaning widowhood, somewhat paradoxically, was one of the few states in which a wealthy Tudor woman genuinely held legal autonomy. Many noblewomen found themselves considerably more powerful as widows than they had ever been as wives, and more than a few showed absolutely no hurry to give that status back through remarriage. Within these tight legal constraints, the actual scope of a wealthy woman's influence could be remarkable. Managing a great household, an operation involving hundreds of staff, significant finances, and constant logistical demands, fell largely to the lady of the house, and doing it well required precisely the skills that formal law pretended women simply didn't possess. Financial management, supplier negotiation, staff supervision, and hospitality on a genuinely grand scale. A great lord whose wife ran an effective household was a lord whose affairs continued running smoothly during his frequent absences at court or on campaign. This work was, by its very nature, largely invisible precisely because it was done well. At court, the Queen's ladies-in-waiting occupied a position of extraordinary proximity to real power. Serving as a gentlewoman of the Privy Chamber meant daily, intimate contact with the Queen herself, helping her dress, sitting with her in private, hearing her honest opinions on matters of real consequence. The information flowing through these deeply private spaces, moods, preferences, unguarded opinions belonging to the most powerful woman in the country, carried enormous value, and the women occupying these positions were never simply passive witnesses to it. They actively participated in the court's information economy, quietly passing intelligence outward and carrying petitions inward, navigating precisely the same currents of favor and danger that their male counterparts managed in the more public rooms of the palace. Education, for women of the Tudor upper class, was genuinely impressive by the standards of the age. The humanist movement of the early Tudor period produced an entire generation of women with real scholarly accomplishment, fluent in Latin, well-versed in classical literature, capable of engaging seriously in theological and philosophical debate with the most learned men of their era. This wasn't considered an unusual achievement for women of high rank. It was the expected standard. And yet, the very education that trained these women to think clearly, argue persuasively, and understand the world in genuinely sophisticated terms was then, almost immediately after marriage, redirected exclusively toward influence rather than authority, toward suggestion rather than direct decision-making, toward the patient, careful management of a husband's opinion rather than the open expression of one's own. The most accomplished Tudor noblewomen managed this fundamental contradiction with extraordinary grace. Those who pushed against it too visibly became, in the retelling of history, cautionary tales marriage. A business deal wearing a wedding dress marriage among the Tudor wealthy functioned, first and foremost, as a business transaction, conducted fluently in the shared language of diplomacy, land transfer, and strategic family alliance. Love was rarely, if ever, the actual point. Compatibility mattered even less. What genuinely mattered was which two families were merging, what land and titles would change hands, what political connections were being secured, and whether the intended bride was young enough to be reasonably expected to produce surviving heirs before her husband's estate finances deteriorated any further. Negotiating a wealthy Tudor marriage contract could take years, routinely involved lawyers and sometimes ambassadors, and frequently concluded in a formal ceremony where the two people actually getting married had met, at most, a handful of times beforehand. The process typically began with the identification of suitable candidates, a search shaped heavily by rank, religious affiliation, existing land holdings, presumed fertility, political loyalty, and crucially, the debts already attached to each family's estate. Intermediaries conducted careful early inquiries. Heralds formally verified genealogies. Lawyers pored over title deeds. Eventually, conversation narrowed down to hard financial terms: the bride's dowry, the groom's marriage settlement, and the jointure arrangement guaranteeing the wife's financial security if she was widowed. All of this was negotiated at considerable length, often with real tension on both sides, while both families worked hard to avoid appearing openly desperate for the match, desperation being, in Tudor marriage negotiations, as in most negotiations throughout history, a significant and costly disadvantage. Church doctrine technically required the consent of both parties before a marriage could proceed, a requirement that sounds meaningful right up until you consider the actual circumstances under which that consent was typically given. A 16-year-old girl whose family had spent the better part of a year and a half negotiating her marriage to a man she'd met perhaps twice, was realistically in no meaningful position to withhold consent. The formal requirement was honored on paper. The correct words were spoken, while the practical reality of family pressure, financial necessity, and the near total absence of any real alternative rendered genuine refusal essentially theoretical. What followed the wedding ceremony itself varied far more than the negotiations leading up to it might suggest. Some Tudor marriages among the wealthy genuinely blossomed into real partnerships. Couples who discovered authentic companionship, shared interests, and even real love growing out of what had begun as a coldly calculated arrangement. Surviving letters and diaries from the period contain clear, sincere evidence of affection, of genuine grief at a spouse's death, of marriages that were, by any reasonable measure, quietly happy. The system producing these marriages was undeniably cold-blooded. The human beings living inside it, evidently, were not always so. Other marriages were predictably miserable. Two strangers, brought together entirely by their families' financial interests, sharing a household, and expected to raise children together with essentially no realistic path toward separation if the arrangement proved genuinely incompatible. Divorce remained, for all practical purposes, entirely unavailable to anyone who hadn't managed to drag the entire English Reformation into their personal marital situation. A solution genuinely available to exactly one man in Tudor England. And even he, as history records at considerable length, found the process rather more complicated than anticipated. Religion as a survival game, the Reformation and the wealthy. For most wealthy Tudor families, the English Reformation was never really a matter of deep theological conviction. It was, above all else, an extremely high-stakes navigation problem. Under Henry VIII, the sudden break with Rome created enormous new opportunities for anyone quick enough to seize a share of the monastic lands suddenly flooding onto the market. Under his son, Edward VI, Protestant reforms accelerated sharply. Under Mary I, Catholicism returned in force, and people were burned alive for holding the wrong opinion. Under Elizabeth I, a cautious, carefully balanced Protestant settlement finally took hold. For any nobleman with a family, an estate, and a functioning survival instinct, staying on the correct side of all these shifts required a level of ideological flexibility that, in hindsight, looks almost athletic. The dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII represented the single largest redistribution of land in England since the Norman conquest, nearly 500 years earlier. Monasteries and convents had spent centuries accumulating property through donations and bequests. Agricultural land, urban buildings, manor houses, mills, and fish ponds. When Henry moved to dissolve these institutions and seize their assets between 1536 and 1540, all of that accumulated property suddenly became available. The crown sold much of it off, often at genuinely favorable prices, to noblemen and gentry families, quick enough to spot the opportunity and well-connected enough to get their offers considered. Families that moved fast and bid confidently emerged from the dissolution with dramatically enlarged estates. Families that hesitated or that were too closely tied to the old religious order watched the entire redistribution happen from the sidelines. For many wealthy families, the underlying theology mattered far less than the immediate practical question of where the government currently stood. Henry's own religious reforms were, in doctrinal terms, a somewhat inconsistent affair. He broke decisively with Rome over the question of papal authority, yet continued to personally believe in core Catholic doctrines like transubstantiation, and over the course of his reign, executed both Catholics who denied his supremacy over the Church and Protestants who denied his more traditional theological beliefs, with a striking even-handedness that suggested his real priority was obedience, not correct belief. Under Edward VI, the pace of Protestant reform accelerated dramatically. Altars stripped bare, religious images removed from churches, the traditional Latin Mass replaced with an English prayer book. Families with genuine Protestant convictions embraced these changes wholeheartedly. Families quietly holding onto Catholic sympathies performed the required outward compliance while maintaining a far more private devotional life behind closed doors. Then, in 1553, Mary came to the throne and reversed nearly everything at once, restoring Catholic practice and having close to 300 Protestants burned as heretics, demanding, in turn, an equally rapid, equally visible demonstration of renewed Catholic loyalty from a nobility that had spent the previous 6 years carefully proving the opposite. The human cost of these repeated reversals was entirely real. Some individuals held firmly to their genuine beliefs at the ultimate cost of their own lives. The Protestant martyrs of Mary's reign, later recorded in painstaking detail in Fox's Book of Martyrs, ensuring their stories were never forgotten. Others adjusted their outward religious practice with remarkable speed and flexibility, managing to survive all 4 consecutive Tudor reigns without ever formally committing to a religious position that couldn't later be quietly revised. This wasn't admirable, exactly, but it was, given the stakes involved, entirely understandable. You had an estate to protect. You had a family name that had taken generations to build. In a world where holding the wrong religious opinion could genuinely cost you everything, the private calculation between principle and survival was one that a great many people made quietly and had absolutely no intention of ever discussing openly again. The hidden cost of looking wealthy, debt among the nobility. Here's something that rarely makes it into the more romantic retellings of Tudor history. Being a great lord was extraordinarily, relentlessly expensive, and a striking number of noble families lived in a state of near constant debt. The expectation of lavish hospitality, maintaining an enormous household staff, hosting elaborate feasts, being prepared to entertain the king himself on short notice required continuous, heavy expenditure. Building projects, court wardrobes that needed constant updating, gifts sent to secure and maintain political favor, legal costs incurred defending or expanding an estate's boundaries. A Tudor nobleman who appeared wealthy was frequently a Tudor nobleman who owed a genuinely significant amount of money to a genuinely significant number of people, and who was quietly hopping nobody asked too many pointed questions all at once. Nothing sent quite the same tremor through a noble family's finances as the announcement of a royal progress. When the monarch traveled through the countryside during the summer months, staying at the homes of noblemen along the route, the sheer honor of hosting a royal visit was enormous, and the associated cost was often genuinely ruinous. The king or queen never traveled alone. They arrived with their entire court, their household staff, their guard, and a logistical tail stretching to hundreds of additional people, all of whom needed to be housed, fed, and entertained for the full duration of the stay. The host family absorbed the entire expense because politely declining the honor of hosting royalty simply wasn't a position that could be expressed without serious political consequences. A single royal visit could easily cost a nobleman several years' worth of income in a matter of days, and several houses that received the genuine honor of an extended visit from Elizabeth I during her long reign never fully recovered financially. They built entirely new rooms specifically for her comfort. They replanted their gardens. They commissioned elaborate pageants and performances. They served feasts of staggering, almost absurd elaboration. And they did every bit of it while smiling warmly, because visibly struggling to afford the honor of a royal visit was considered a far greater embarrassment than the resulting debt itself. Patronage functioned as the underlying mechanism that kept this entire system moving. A great nobleman wasn't simply a consumer of resources. He also functioned as a distributor of them, and his ability to secure court positions, land leases, trading licenses, and favorable legal outcomes for people within his personal network formed a significant part of his actual social value. Clients, in return, offered gifts, money, legal support, political loyalty, and useful intelligence. The patron, in turn, offered access, protection, and influence. Both sides understood the arrangement perfectly well, even though neither side ever described it quite so bluntly out loud. Moneylenders and merchants extended credit to the nobility on a scale that would feel entirely familiar to any modern person carrying a large personal debt. Interest rates ran high, land served as collateral, and the consequences of defaulting were severe enough that most noble families managed their debts with genuine care, careful to avoid ever letting matters reach the point of formal legal enforcement. Italian banking houses provided sophisticated credit instruments that the Tudor wealthy relied on extensively throughout the period. Being quietly in debt to a foreign banking house was notably considered far less socially embarrassing than being visibly unable to maintain your household at its expected scale. A telling detail about exactly where the Tudor mind placed its priorities between financial discretion and social appearance. The fundamental paradox at the heart of it all was simple. The very thing that defined you as wealthy, visible, continuous, lavish spending was precisely the thing most likely to erode that wealth over time. A great house demanded constant maintenance. A large household demanded constant wages. Court life demanded a wardrobe that never stopped needing to look current. Political survival demanded gifts, favors, and the constant careful lubrication of relationships that might otherwise turn cold without warning. You spent because your position required it. You borrowed to keep spending because the alternative, appearing to have less than your rank suggested you should, was simply unthinkable. And then, quietly, you managed the resulting debt. You hoped the rents arrived on schedule. You married your children into families with better managed finances, and you kept the entire elaborate performance running for one more year, which was, in the end, about as far ahead as anyone in this world could really afford to plan. Raising heirs, childhood in a wealthy Tudor household. Children born into wealthy Tudor families weren't primarily regarded as children in the way we think of childhood today. They were, first and foremost, dynastic assets, future alliance partners, heirs to be carefully preserved, raised, and eventually deployed strategically. Infant mortality remained high enough throughout the period that having many children was considered simple prudence rather than excess, and the death of a child, while genuinely mourned, was processed within a framework that treated it as a sadly common outcome rather than an unthinkable tragedy. Wet nurses handled feeding. Rockers handled sleep. The parents themselves appeared periodically, assessed the child's progress, and then returned to the ongoing business of running an estate and managing their own precarious political position. The nursery in a great Tudor household functioned as its own separate establishment within the wider household, staffed by a team of women whose collective purpose was the physical care and early development of the family's children. The wet nurse held the most important role of all, typically a woman whose own infant had recently died or been weaned, employed specifically to breastfeed the noble baby. The prevailing medical belief of the time held that a noblewoman's own constitution was too delicate for nursing, and that the physical act itself might interfere with her ability to become pregnant again promptly, which mattered enormously, since producing further heirs as quickly as possible remained a constant, unspoken priority. Wet nurses were selected with real care, since their milk was widely believed to transmit not just nutrition, but elements of moral character as well, and a family raising children of genuine quality took the selection of a nurse's reputation seriously. Rockers were responsible for keeping an infant's cradle in constant, gentle motion. A task that sounds simple enough until you consider that it was, in practice, someone's genuine full-time occupation carried out in careful overnight shifts, because contemporary medical thinking held continuous rocking to be essential for a healthy infant's sleep. A wealthy Tudor baby was, as a direct result, essentially never left alone and never left unrocked, surrounded from its very first days by a level of constant physical attention that its own parents rarely provided in person, but comprehensively arranged and paid for. Baptism took place within days of a child's birth, driven largely by the alarmingly high rate of newborn mortality. An unbaptized infant who died was considered both a devastating personal loss and a genuine theological emergency. The baptism ceremony itself functioned as a real social event. Godparents were chosen carefully, based heavily on the alliances and connections they represented for the family, and their expected gifts were received with exactly the same careful calculation that governed nearly every other exchange in wealthy Tudor life. A well-connected godparent represented one more valuable thread woven into the family's ever-expanding web of useful relationships. As children grew older, their formal education began early and was pursued with a seriousness reflecting both genuine parental care and clear-eyed strategic intent. A son who survived into adulthood needed to be capable of managing the family estate, performing competently at court, and carrying himself with exactly the dignity his family's name demanded. A daughter needed to be marriageable, educated, socially accomplished, healthy, and possessed of enough personal charm and polish to attract the kind of family her parents hoped to ally with. Childhood in this world was essentially preparation for adult function, and the nursery represented only the very first stage of a long process meant to eventually produce a well-positioned adult ready to contribute meaningfully to the family's continued survival. The genuine emotional texture of Tudor parenting is somewhat harder to recover fully than its rigid structural arrangements. Surviving letters clearly express real grief at the loss of children, real delight at their early accomplishments, and real anxiety during serious illness. The strategic framework surrounding these children didn't prevent their parents from loving them, and the surviving evidence strongly suggests that most parents genuinely did, but that love coexisted quite comfortably, alongside a clear-eyed practical assessment of each child's role and value within the family's larger long-term project. And in Tudor England, these two things had always managed to sit side by side without any apparent contradiction. Education, Latin humanism, and the making of a gentleman, the humanist education movement of the Tudor period, meant that wealthy children were put through a genuinely demanding curriculum, rigorous by the standards of any era. Latin was mandatory and formed the absolute foundation. Greek was considered highly desirable. Rhetoric, logic, history, music, and mathematics all rounded out the expected course of study. For boys of noble birth, this education represented direct preparation for a future life in royal service, the law, or the church. For girls of the same social class, the picture grew considerably more complicated. An excellent education was genuinely valued as a mark of family distinction, and then largely set aside once a suitable marriage had been arranged. Latin wasn't treated as some optional background subject, vaguely absorbed over time. It functioned as the working language of intellectual life, legal practice, the church, and international diplomacy. Essentially, the operating system of educated European civilization at large. A nobleman's son who couldn't read and write fluent Latin was a nobleman's son facing a genuine, lasting disadvantage in nearly every professional context he might later encounter. Formal study began early, progressing steadily through the works of Cicero, Virgil, and Caesar, and in the very best cases, produced young men capable of composing original prose in classical Latin with genuine literary style. Men for whom reading ancient texts felt as natural as reading their own native tongue. This curriculum was shaped heavily by humanist scholars like Erasmus and Thomas More, both of whom argued that the true purpose of education wasn't merely practical competence, but the deliberate formation of character, the cultivation of virtue, sound judgment, and genuine wisdom, rather than the simple accumulation of raw information. This underlying philosophy produced an educational approach that wove together classical languages, moral philosophy, history, and rhetoric, all built on the shared assumption that the person being educated would one day exercise real responsibility and needed to be prepared for it at the deepest possible level. Private tutors served as the primary mechanism of education for wealthy children. A great household might employ several at once. A humanist scholar for classical languages and the liberal arts, a music master for instrumental and vocal training, a dancing master to teach the specific court dances that social life demanded. For the very grandest families, tutors of genuine scholarly reputation were actively sought out. Men who had studied at Europe's finest universities, published serious academic work, and brought real intellectual weight to the household. Educating a future earl was considered a genuinely serious undertaking, and the men entrusted with that responsibility were fully aware they were shaping someone who might one day sit at a king's council table. Boys of noble families also commonly spent time living within the households of other great lords, not as servants in any demeaning sense, but as pages and gentlemen in waiting, absorbing the practical education of great house life directly, alongside their more formal academic studies. You learned how a great household truly operated by living inside one. You learned how a genuinely powerful man conducted himself by watching him closely, day after day. You absorbed the subtle social codes, the behavioral expectations, and the fine gradations of rank and courtesy that no classroom tutor could ever fully convey. The household itself functioned as the final, most important semester of your entire education, and the lord whose household you entered became, in a very real sense, your last and most consequential teacher. For girls, the early curriculum closely mirrored that of their brothers, the same languages, the same underlying philosophy, the same musical training. But the ultimate purpose differed sharply. A well-educated daughter was, above all, a more marriageable daughter, whose visible accomplishments reflected well on her entire family and helped attract a stronger, more advantageous match. After marriage, this same scholarly education generally stopped functioning as an active pursuit in its own right, and instead became a set of tools quietly deployed in service of the household, the children, and the ongoing management of family relationships. Some women, admittedly, continued reading, writing, and thinking seriously throughout their entire lives. The system rarely stopped them outright. It simply failed to actively support them, which was, in its own quiet way, a different kind of obstacle entirely. One requiring considerably more personal determination to navigate around. The fall, how quickly everything could disappear. One of the defining features of life at the very top of Tudor society was the sheer, total instability of absolutely everything. A position at court, a title, an estate, a carefully arranged marriage alliance. All of it could evaporate with terrifying speed if the political winds shifted even slightly. If a rival whispered exactly the right thing into exactly the wrong ear, or if the king simply changed his mind. The careers of Thomas Wolsey, Thomas More, and later Thomas Cromwell all followed strikingly similar arcs. Extraordinary rise, extraordinary fall, and a final act that none of the parties involved particularly enjoyed. Thomas Wolsey spent roughly 2 decades as, in practical terms, the most powerful man in England after the king himself. He served as Lord Chancellor, held the rank of cardinal within the church, effectively architected English foreign policy, oversaw construction of the magnificent Hampton Court, and maintained a personal household that genuinely rivaled the royal court itself in scale and splendor. He had risen from relatively humble beginnings. His father worked as a butcher in Ipswich, a fact his many enemies never once tired of mentioning. Through a combination of genuine brilliance, tireless energy, and total, unwavering dedication to making himself indispensable to the crown. For roughly 2 decades, the strategy worked spectacularly well. Then Henry VIII wanted his marriage to Catherine of Aragon formally annulled. Wolsey, despite years of service, ultimately couldn't deliver it. Within roughly 2 years, he had been stripped of virtually everything he owned, formally charged with treason, and died on the road while being escorted to face trial. The full transition from untouchable to utterly ruined took only about 18 months. He had personally watched this exact pattern happen to others many times before, and evidently had never quite believed it could happen to him. Thomas More's downfall followed a somewhat different shape, though the underlying structure remained strikingly similar. More was a man of genuine, deeply held principle, a respected humanist scholar, the author of Utopia, an exceptionally skilled lawyer, and a man whose personal integrity was so widely and thoroughly acknowledged that Henry VIII specifically trusted him with the role of Lord Chancellor, precisely because everyone understood he could never be bought or pressured. Then Henry asked him to formally endorse the break from Rome and accept the king's new supremacy over the English church. And More, a devout, lifelong Catholic who had built his entire worldview around the primacy of individual conscience, quietly declined to offer that endorsement. He didn't publicly attack the king. He didn't organize any visible resistance. He simply refused to say yes and exercised what he clearly believed was his right to remain silent on the matter entirely. In Tudor England, however, silence on the question of royal supremacy was interpreted, functionally, as active opposition. And opposition, in this context, meant treason. He was executed in 1535. The very same quality of unwavering integrity that had once made him so valuable and trustworthy became, the moment real disagreement entered the picture, precisely what made him dangerous. And Henry VIII was never a king inclined to leave dangerous men standing at large. The Tower of London loomed over the entirety of Tudor political life, both as a literal building and as a constant psychological presence. It functioned as a prison, yes, but a very specific kind, reserved almost exclusively for people of genuine consequence, for the lords, ladies, and senior counselors whose circumstances had shifted dramatically enough that they needed to be safely contained, while their ultimate fate was decided elsewhere. Being sent to the Tower didn't automatically guarantee a death sentence. People were sometimes released after periods of confinement, occasionally even restored to a degree of royal favor. But it was never, under any circumstances, reassuring. And the simple knowledge that the Tower existed, that a barge could arrive for absolutely anyone on any given morning, formed a quiet, constant background condition of Tudor court life, one that everyone lived with and almost nobody ever discussed openly. What made this particular danger so genuinely destabilizing was its fundamental unpredictability. Looking backward, historians can often trace clear warning signs, the specific moments when the ground visibly began to shift beneath someone's feet. But living through it in real time offered nowhere near that same clarity. Royal favor ran warm, then it cooled, then it turned cold, then dangerously cold. And at nearly every stage from the inside, it could plausibly still look temporary, recoverable, survivable. The courtiers who managed to survive longest were, almost without exception, the ones who read these early warning signals fastest and adjusted accordingly. stepping quietly back before they were pushed, retreating to a country, a state well before any formal summons arrived, deliberately making themselves small and unremarkable enough that the coming storm simply passed over them. Pulling this off required real political intelligence, genuinely excellent information networks, and a rare willingness to voluntarily sacrifice position before that position could be forcibly taken away. Some managed it successfully. A great many did not. And virtually all of them, if we're being entirely honest, spent a substantial portion of their careers living in a state of quiet, comprehensive, carefully hidden fear. Whispers as currency, gossip, letters, and the information economy of the court. In an age with no newspapers, news at the Tudor court traveled the old-fashioned way, person to person, corridor to corridor, wrapped in carefully chosen language and delivered with an air of studied casualness. Gossip at court was never idle chatter. It functioned as genuine intelligence, knowing who had been summoned to private audience with the king, who had recently been seen entering whose private chambers, whose star was quietly rising, and whose had just as quietly begun to dim. All of it carried real value. The best connected courtiers were the ones who had spent years carefully cultivating personal networks of information, giving them early warning of whatever was coming next, which in Tudor England usually meant either a genuine opportunity or an approaching catastrophe. The physical architecture of a Tudor palace was, in many respects, designed for observation nearly as much as for ceremony. Corridors connected the various chambers in ways that created natural bottlenecks, points where courtiers were forced to pass by one another and inevitably be seen. Antechambers, the waiting rooms positioned just before more private inner spaces, became places where people gathered in close, enforced proximity, holding conversations with individuals who happened to also be their direct rivals. Even the simple act of waiting carried its own information. Who was made to wait, and for how long, told everyone watching something meaningful about that person's current standing. The gentleman usher who controlled access to a great lord's or the king's inner chambers held, as a direct result, one of the most quietly information-rich positions at the entire court, sitting precisely at the point where the public and private worlds of the palace intersected. Letters served as the long-distance equivalent of that same corridor conversation, and Tudor correspondence was written with the constant awareness that a letter might well be read by someone other than its intended recipient. Letters were regularly intercepted, secretly copied, and later presented as damning evidence. Seals could be carefully broken, the contents read, and the seal skillfully replaced, allowing a letter to continue on its way without the original sender ever realizing it had been compromised. Sophisticated writers learned to encode genuinely sensitive information in language that communicated one clear meaning to its intended reader, and something entirely harmless to anyone who happened to intercept it along the way. A skill, the most politically active courtiers cultivated much the way modern professionals develop a careful, guarded email manner, only with dramatically higher personal stakes for getting it wrong. Women, interestingly, proved particularly effective operators within this information economy. For reasons the male-dominated power structure had somewhat inadvertently created for them. The Queen's ladies, her gentlewomen and maids of honor, had regular access to private spaces and candid conversations that male courtiers simply could not enter. They heard things directly. They witnessed genuine moments of private honesty that their male counterparts could only ever receive secondhand, filtered through someone else's account. The information flowing continuously through the Queen's private household functioned as both a valuable resource and a serious personal responsibility, and the women who managed it most skillfully understood that discretion and the strategic, careful deployment of what they knew weren't contradictory skills at all. They were two halves of the very same skill. Rumor, notably, traveled at an entirely different speed than genuinely verified intelligence, and Tudor court life contained both in generous supply. A single whispered claim that the king had frowned in someone's direction during dinner could trigger an entire afternoon of anxious speculation, whether or not the underlying story held any truth at all. The person whose name had suddenly become attached to that frown would spend the rest of the day quietly reviewing their recent behavior, searching for a possible cause. Friends and allies would begin gathering information on their behalf. By the time the evening meal arrived, the entire episode had either grown into something genuinely significant or quietly deflated into nothing at all, depending entirely on what more reliable information had managed to surface in the meantime. Successfully managing this constant churn, staying outwardly calm in the face of endless rumor, while quietly pursuing real clarity through better sources, was one of the fundamental, unglamorous skills required for long-term survival at court. Courtiers who panicked at every passing whisper simply did not last very long in an environment that generated whispers constantly and took absolutely no responsibility for their accuracy, sugar subtleties, and the sweet ruin of Elizabeth's teeth. Separate from the main feast entirely, the Tudor banquet was its own distinct occasion. Served in a dedicated banqueting house or a separate room set apart from the Great Hall, and composed almost entirely of sweet things. Candied fruits, marzipan shaped into intricate figures, and comfits, small seeds or spices coated repeatedly in hardened sugar, were served in tiny decorative dishes. The entire purpose of this final course was to demonstrate access to refined sugar, an ingredient so expensive and so thoroughly imported that its mere presence on the table, in any form, functioned as an unmistakable signal of serious expenditure. That this same sugar was steadily destroying the teeth of everyone eating it was well understood at the time, and considered, apparently, not remotely sufficient reason to stop. Sugar in Tudor England bore, almost no resemblance to the cheap, universal commodity it would later become. It arrived along complicated trade routes, originating in Mediterranean and Atlantic sugar-producing regions, changing hands among multiple merchants before finally reaching an English kitchen. And it cost enough that serving it, in any quantity or form, at your table amounted to an unmistakable financial statement. The elaborate sugar sculptures known as subtleties, castles, heraldic animals, ships, entire allegorical scenes rendered in painstaking detail from sugar paste, were displayed at the table primarily to be admired and discussed before they were ever eaten, and were sometimes deliberately preserved rather than consumed at all, since destroying such careful workmanship by simply eating it felt, to many hosts, like a genuine waste. The banqueting house itself represented a genuine architectural innovation of the Tudor period. A small, often elaborately decorated separate building, set apart from the main house, constructed specifically for serving this final sweet course and its accompanying entertainment. The rooftop banqueting house at Hardwicke Hall and similar structures at estates like Longleat functioned as purpose-built stages for a very particular kind of intimate social theater. Being invited into the banqueting house after the conclusion of the main feast meant being invited into the more relaxed, playful final act of the evening. And the building's smaller scale and concentrated decorative luxury created an atmosphere the Great Hall, for all its grandeur, simply couldn't replicate. Comfits remained the individual suite of choice, typically small seeds or spices, most commonly anise, caraway, or coriander, encased in multiple careful layers of hardened sugar through a slow, repeated process of coating and drying that demanded real skill from a trained confectioner. The finished result was a small, jewel-like treat that could be held delicately in the hand or offered directly to another person. A small social gesture that carried a genuine intimacy. Here, take one of these carefully made, expensive small things, passed directly from my hand into yours. This particular kind of small physical warmth stood as an interesting counterpoint to the far more calculating, transactional nature of most other Tudor social exchanges. The marzipan work produced by a genuinely skilled Tudor confectioner could be extraordinary. Almond paste, mixed carefully with sugar and rosewater, and colored using both vegetable and mineral dyes, was molded into shapes of startling variety and realism. Fruits that looked more convincing than actual fruit. Animals rendered in fine detail. Entire miniature garden scenes. The confectioner capable of producing this kind of work was a genuine craftsperson, and their skill represented one further way a host could demonstrate not just wealth, but real refinement. Anyone with enough money could simply buy expensive sugar. Turning that sugar into something genuinely beautiful required real talent. And talent, in this world, made its own distinct kind of statement. Elizabeth I was, according to multiple surviving contemporary accounts, especially fond of sweet things, and she consumed them in quantities that her teeth eventually reflected quite dramatically. One well-known contemporary account describes her teeth as visibly black by later in her reign, a condition several visiting observers directly linked to England's broader national habit of excessive sugar consumption among the wealthy, that the single most powerful woman in all of Europe had, in effect, ruined her own teeth through unrestrained access to the very luxury she could afford in such abundance, stands as one of the Tudor period's more pointed, quietly ironic footnotes, and perhaps also a useful reminder that having unlimited access to expensive things and actually exercising good judgment about them have never quite been the same skill. On the road, moving an entire household, when a wealthy Tudor family relocated to court to a distant country estate to visit relatives, or to follow the monarch on a royal progress, they never simply packed a single bag and departed. They moved the entire household. Furniture was carefully disassembled and transported. Silver plate and tapestries were wrapped, crated, and loaded onto carts. Horses were assembled and readied. Additional carts were hired as needed. The whole operation could easily take several days simply to organize, and the resulting procession of people, animals, and luggage stretched visibly along the road, itself broadcasting the family's status to absolutely everyone they passed, which was, in no small part, precisely the point. Tudor roads, unfortunately, were never built to withstand this kind of heavy, continuous traffic. Most were entirely unpaved tracks, which became deeply rutted after rain, churned quickly into thick mud by the weight of heavily loaded carts, and in some regions became genuinely impassable during the worst stretches of winter. The Tudor government wasn't entirely unaware of the problem. There were periodic legislative attempts to improve road maintenance across the period, but the underlying infrastructure remained persistently poor throughout, and traveling any real distance was invariably slower, more physically uncomfortable, and more logistically demanding than the eventual destination ever quite seemed to justify. A journey of only 50 miles could easily consume the better part of a week. Whenever weather and road conditions turned against the traveler, the household goods that traveled alongside a great family were genuinely extensive, largely because the destination houses themselves were often insufficiently furnished to accommodate a family's full needs without significant supplementation. Great estates typically maintained what was known as a standing household, a skeleton staff who kept the house minimally functional during the family's absence. But the finest furnishings, the best silver plate, the important tapestries, and the full contents of the family wardrobe all traveled together, because these weren't simply possessions. They were the essential physical apparatus of visible status, and arriving anywhere without them meant arriving, in a very real sense, incomplete. Horses powered this entire operation, and a great household stable represented a substantial establishment entirely in its own right. Riding horses for the family and senior staff, pack horses for baggage, sturdy draft horses for the heaviest loaded carts, and spare horses held in reserve in case of lameness or injury along the route, managing the feeding, care, and general welfare of this many horses, while traveling required its own team of dedicated specialists, and the overall cost of relocating a large household was, more often than not, dominated almost entirely by horse-related expenses. The physical experience of travel, even for the genuinely wealthy, remained considerably better than what most other travelers on the same roads endured. But the overall baseline was low enough that better still left enormous room for real improvement. A good horse, a well-made saddle, a quality wool cloak, and the ability to reliably claim the better rooms at inns along the route were all genuine advantages. But the roads themselves were the same roads everyone else traveled. The distances remained the same distances. And the weather, notably, made absolutely no special accommodation for rank. Rain fell equally on earls and ploughmen alike, and a flooded river crossing was a flooded river crossing, entirely indifferent to how many servants happened to be waiting anxiously on the opposite bank. You arrived at your destination, eventually, mud-splattered and stiff from the road, and the very first order of business upon arrival was quietly restoring the appearance of effortless magnificence before anyone of real importance had the chance to notice the journey still written plainly across your face, portraits, music, and the legacy left behind. The great Tudor portrait was never really an exercise in simple vanity. It functioned, first and foremost, as a political document, commissioning a portrait from a recognized master painter, and having it displayed prominently, copied for wider distribution, or sent abroad to prospective allies and marriage candidates, communicated a very specific, carefully calculated set of messages about your status, your connections, your accumulated wealth, and your confidence in your own position, secure enough to permanently commit your own face to public record. Hans Holbein the Younger's famous portrait of Henry VIII, painted in a pose so deliberately wide-legged and physically imposing that it almost dared the viewer to disagree with what it represented, remains one of the most successful acts of royal image-making in European history. And it was entirely, carefully intentional. The pose itself, feet planted firmly apart, hands resting confidently at his sides, shoulders filling nearly the entire frame, his expression composed somewhere precisely between authority and open challenge, was never a simple, spontaneous capture of the king's natural bearing. It was a constructed image, carefully designed through close collaboration between painter and royal patron, engineered to produce one very specific psychological effect on anyone standing before it. You looked at it, and you felt smaller. That was always the intention. The portrait was power made visible, status translated directly into paint and wood panel. And it succeeded so completely that 5 centuries later, it remains the very first image most people picture when they think of Henry VIII at all. For the wealthy who weren't kings themselves, the portrait served several overlapping purposes at once. Displayed along the length of a family's long gallery, generations of family portraits together formed a kind of visual genealogy, a carefully constructed lineage argument told entirely in paint, demonstrating the depth of a family's history, the quality of its connections, and the sheer continuity of its bloodline across successive generations. A long gallery filled with portraits stretching back several generations was, in effect, a gallery filled with visible evidence of permanence, proof of a family that had mattered for long enough to reasonably expect it would go on mattering. A newly wealthy family with no worthwhile ancestors to paint was, inevitably, a family whose gallery looked noticeably thinner. A fact everyone quietly noticed, and nobody ever mentioned directly. Portraits also functioned as genuine diplomatic instruments. When a marriage was being negotiated between 2 families whose principal parties had never actually met, or between royal houses separated by considerable geographic distance, small miniature portraits were routinely exchanged as a standard part of the process. The miniature portrait, a small, extraordinarily detailed painting compact, enough to be carried in a locket or sealed inside a letter, served, in effect, as the Tudor era's version of a photograph for courtship purposes, meaning skilled miniature painters occupied a genuinely specific and quietly pressured professional niche. You were, in a very real sense, painting someone's actual marriage prospects and striking the right balance between honest accuracy and flattering exaggeration was a serious professional judgment, carrying real consequences if you got it noticeably wrong. The sitters themselves participated actively in shaping the meaning of their own portraits. The clothing chosen for a formal portrait was selected with tremendous care. The finest available fabrics, the most prestigious jewelry, items specifically chosen to communicate rank and connection as clearly as possible. Objects deliberately included in a portrait carried real symbolic weight, easily readable to a contemporary audience. Books signaling learning, gloves signaling gentility, musical instruments signaling personal accomplishment, and specific flowers or plants carrying quiet allegorical messages about virtue or love that a knowledgeable viewer was expected to decode on sight. A Tudor portrait functioned as a kind of visual text as much as a simple image, dense, with layered meaning for anyone who knew how to properly read it. And the sitter had almost always thought very carefully in advance about exactly what they wanted that image to say. What actually survives, the physical legacy of Tudor wealth, is remarkable for how much of it endures, and equally remarkable for how much has quietly vanished. The great houses still standing today Hardwicke Hall, with its famously enormous windows, Burghley House, still dominating its Lincolnshire parkland, Hampton Court, with its astronomical clock, still faithfully marking the hours, represent the genuine success stories. These are the buildings whose families remained wealthy enough and motivated enough to properly maintain them across the intervening centuries. Behind each surviving house sit a dozen others that simply didn't make it, demolished during the 18th century to make room for something more fashionable, lost to fire, sold, and quietly subdivided, or simply left to gradually decay once the family that built them ran out of money, heirs, or both. The Tudor landscape we can walk through today is, in truth, only a carefully curated remnant of a far larger and considerably more fragile original. The surviving portrait collections tell a very similar story. The faces that made it through the centuries, Holbein's extraordinary visual record of the Tudor court, the formal royal, portraits copied and distributed across Europe, the family galleries preserved intact inside houses that themselves survived, represent only a small, unknowable fraction of everything originally painted. War, fire, religious iconoclasm, shifting fashions, and simple centuries of carelessness disposed quietly of the rest. In a real sense, the people who survive today in paint were largely the ones whose descendants happened to value preservation. Meaning, the historical record we've inherited is as much a story about who later generations chose to remember as it is a story about who genuinely mattered during the Tudor period itself. What the Tudor wealthy left behind in purely cultural terms is harder to measure precisely, but arguably proves even more enduring than any single house or portrait. The Reformation that their political calculations helped shape and steer, the break with Rome, the dissolution of the monasteries, the slow construction of a distinctly English national church, produced consequences that echoed for centuries, and in many meaningful ways still shape English life today. The legal and administrative frameworks that Tudor nobles and lawyers built during this period, the parliamentary traditions they participated in and occasionally resisted, the schools and colleges, many of them founded or generously patronized. All of it outlasted the individuals directly involved by many hundreds of years. The men sitting on Henry VII's council were never consciously trying to invent modern parliamentary democracy, but the institutional developments they took part in, the precedents they quietly established, the arguments they made about the proper limits of royal power, all of it contributed, slowly and messily, to the long process by which England gradually became a fundamentally different kind of political nation than the one most of them had been born into. And at the center of all of it sits a very human story, one that remains, across 5 centuries, simultaneously familiar and genuinely strange. People trying desperately to hold on to what they already had. People trying to acquire more than they'd ever been given. People carefully performing a confidence they didn't always actually feel. People loving their own children, both strategically and genuinely, at exactly the same time. People quietly worrying about money while living inside houses specifically built to suggest that money was the one thing they never worried about. People constantly watching the shifting political weather for early warning signs, trying to position themselves correctly before the coming storm finally arrived. All of it wrapped in the most spectacular clothing imaginable, set against a backdrop of carved stone, painted plaster, and flickering candlelight, with a lute playing somewhere down the corridor, and a tapestry hanging on every wall depicting scenes from classical mythology that nobody quite had the time to properly look at. Because there was always someone else in the room whose expression needed careful watching instead. And so, here you are, still breathing, still warm, still safely in possession of all your limbs, your home, and quite happily, your own head. Tonight, you spent several hours at the very top of the Tudor social pyramid. You wore nearly 40 pounds of clothing and called it fashion. You ate roasted swan and called it dinner. You stood in a cold stone corridor for hours, patiently waiting for a king to simply acknowledge that you existed. And when he finally did glance your way, you quietly called it a genuinely excellent day. You navigated feasts and masks and hunting parties, marriage negotiations, sudden religious reversals, and the constant, low hum of a court where royal favor arrived without warning and disappeared exactly the same way. You smiled through nearly all of it. You performed cheerful, effortless confidence so consistently, so relentlessly, that by the end of the evening, you could barely remember what your own actual, unguarded expression even felt like anymore. And yet, running underneath all of it, there was real beauty too. The music drifting through the evening chambers, genuine and completely unhurried. The gardens in high summer, thick with the smell of lavender and freshly cut grass, and something approaching real peace. The portraits that captured, in paint and candlelight, the specific, particular face of a specific, particular person who once stood in a specific room and quietly decided they wanted to be remembered. The houses built with such fierce, restless ambition that 500 years later, they still stop visitors in their tracks. The letters, still carefully preserved in archives today, containing real warmth, real grief, real humor, clear evidence that beneath all the elaborate performance, these were simply people doing their genuine best with the tools and the time they happened to be given. The Tudor wealthy were not admirable in every single direction, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. The cruelty embedded in their world was entirely real. The inequality was staggering by any measure. The system they inhabited and actively upheld disposed of ordinary people's lives with a casualness that should never be softened or excused simply because of the era's undeniable glamour. But they were also complicated, vivid, and genuinely alive, in ways that still reach quietly across the centuries and ask, gently, for our attention. They built things that lasted. They wrote things that endured. They lived through a moment when the entire world was shifting so rapidly that almost nothing felt stable. And somehow, most of them, most of the time, found a way to simply keep going anyway. So tonight, as you settle into your own clean, warm, wonderfully uncomplicated bed, with its entirely reasonable weight of blankets, and its complete, total absence of any political consequences whatsoever, perhaps spare one quiet thought for the exhausted, anxious Earl somewhere in history, drifting off to sleep in a carved four-poster bed, surrounded by watchful attendants, inside a house he'd very nearly bankrupted himself building. During a reign he was never entirely certain he'd survive. He was tired. He was anxious. He was almost certainly wearing a nightcap that cost more than most modern cars. But he made it through one more day, and in Tudor England, quietly, that was really always the entire point. Good night, sleep well, and be very, very glad you don't have to do any of that again tomorrow.